Please welcome Richard Sandell. We're very excited to have him today and tomorrow as our keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Janet. It's really terrific to be here and really nice to have a Janet build it as a more informal evening today before tomorrow to kind of get warmed up for the big conference. And it's a really nice opportunity, again, as Janet said, for me to talk about this project because it is a work in progress. We're still we're coming to the end of it. It's been a 2-year project and it finishes in next month. And parts of that are still being wrestled with and thought through, so it's a really great chance for me to share some of our ideas so far and our practice, and be really good to hear your views and thoughts on it. How we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and set up, give you some background to the project and tell you a little bit about how it came about and what we have been doing. And then we're going to show this film called Behind the Shadow of Merrick, which is one of the projects which we have has formed part of this bigger project. I'm going to show that. It's just 17, 18 minutes long. We could take a chance then to pause and get some of your reactions to that film. And then I've got another sort of 10 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes at the end to talk to you about the emerging results from our visitor evaluation, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So, firstly, the two kind of twin themes of this presentation, activism and agency, are things that I've been really interested in for some time, and I'm talking activism is a really central strand of tomorrow's paper, and really thinking there about activist practice being something which is increasingly, I want to argue, it kind of has been perhaps on the margins of museum practice and should increasingly move towards the centre. And by activist practice, talking there about practice which is underpinned by a set of values, which is very purposeful, which is designed to bring about a more progressive, socially just society. And agency there, really exploring the book that Janet mentioned that I published just a couple of years ago, was really looking at the evidence for social agency in museums, the evidence for the way in which they don't simply reflect the kind of social mores of the day, but really are active in shaping and configuring the ways in which people think about differences. So those are my kind of twin themes, if you like. The project itself has been our most ambitious project coming out of RCMG, the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at my department at Leicester. A £500,000 project. It took us a long time to get the money, mainly from the Heritage Lottery Fund. So that's kind of set up by the government, funded through, there's a number of good causes that are funded by the lottery, of which heritage is one, arts is another, there are other good causes. But we got most of our funding there, some from Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and my own university put in some funding too. So really kind of some key strands to this project. It builds on earlier research which myself and others have done, which is exploring museums as sites of moral activism, as places where a particular moral standpoint can be developed, taken up, and can be communicated in a way which is designed to build support for that particular viewpoint, build support amongst visitors, amongst communities, amongst other stakeholders. So really exploring that idea of agency, of taking up a particular standpoint and trying to build support for it. We worked with 9 partner museums across the UK, so 9 very different partners, and we selected them very carefully. They're very wide-ranging, so in terms of size and governance, they go from the Imperial War Museum in London, so a big nationally funded museum, through to a small volunteer-run museum in the north of England, Whitby Museum. We wanted a variety of museums in terms of size and governance. We wanted a variety of collection types, because the one thing that holds the 9 projects together is they're all concerned with interpreting disability and representing disabled people in different ways. So that's the bit that holds them together, but we wanted to explore that across a range of different collection types. We also wanted, and in that group there are some museums that have real experience of working with communities and perhaps dealing with more contentious subjects, but there are also some museums that have very limited experience in that, and we wanted to take those 9 museums on a journey, collaborative, supported journey, which was to enter a new area of museum practice, one which hadn't really been explored before. So a really diverse mix of museums. The think tank was absolutely critical to the project. It's absolutely the heart of our project. It was a think tank comprised of disabled activists, artists, cultural practitioners, a group of people who played an absolutely critical role in shaping the content and the tone of each of those 9 projects. So they worked very, very closely with the museums over a 2-year period to help them develop the interpretation, the particular narratives that they set out to do. Social versus medical models of disability. We wanted to look for a particular way of framing our projects, and the disability studies literature and the disability rights movement often positions 2 very different ways of understanding disability, which were really central to our project. The kind of, if you're not familiar with those, the sort of dominant way in which disability is discussed and represented in the media, and the dominant way indeed in which I think most of us view and think about disability, is a medical model. It's a medical model which focuses on the individual, on the kind of particular issues, what's wrong with their body. It identifies the idea of cure, medical cure, as the way forward for sort of treating you know, that as the problem, if you like, is lying with the body. It's an individualised, medicalised understanding of disability. And some 30 years ago, the disabled people's movement in the UK developed the social model of disability, which is really turned that on its head. It takes the idea of disability and places it away from the individual and the body and in society. So it's society which disables people with a whole range of impairments by virtue of physical barriers, attitudinal barriers. A whole range of barriers exist which construct disability on top of people's impairments. And that has been a really key, crucial conceptual tool for the disability rights movement, and it's one we drew upon again and again to help shape the content of each of our 9 projects. The last point was that we very purposefully wanted to inform contemporary debates about disability. So what unites those 9 projects together is a desire to reshape the way in which people think about disability. And some of those debates, for example, about cure, that's something I'm going to touch on again tomorrow. There are, you know, kind of rights of disabled people are quite contested debates in society today, and we wanted to make a contribution to those. I'm just going to say a little bit about the context for this big project for rethinking disability representation. There's a number of different contexts it can draw upon, and one is the emerging literature from disability studies, which has looked at representations of disabled people, not in museums. They haven't really kind of got around to exploring museums. That was the contribution we wanted to make, but they have looked at representations of disabled people in the news media, in charity advertising, in film, in literature, and kind of looked and concluded that there are a handful of very often dehumanising, demeaning stereotypes which are played out again and again and again throughout the media. So you get disabled person as freak, so that's kind of emphasising the particular physical difference at the expense of everything else. You get disabled people stereotypes around disabled people as being passive, as being recipients of charity, as being economically inactive, beggars and so on. A range of different stereotypes. For example, in film it's very common in a lot of Hollywood movies, for example, and Bond movies is the classic where somebody's physical difference is a shorthand for evil. So you often get a Bond villain that's facially disfigured or disabled in some other way. And there's kind of a whole literature about those stereotypes and efforts to try and pull at them, fray them a little bit. So that was one starting point. The other, looking at the museum context, as you'll all know, museums, I think, have become increasingly interested in disability over the last couple of decades, but it's been almost entirely, certainly in my experience, some fantastic work going on around access, trying to promote more accessible and more inclusive institutions, so looking at disabled people as a potential audience who have often been poorly served, and looked at ways to make more accessible our facilities and services, and that's been really important development, still a long way to go. But one of the things we were interested in is, at the same time, there's been growth, as you'll know, in growing interest in a whole range of hidden histories and trying to represent a whole range of different communities in different ways. So women, indigenous, black and minority ethnic communities, for example, but disabled people, representing disabled people and engaging with disability as a topic had been, we felt, very, very seriously overlooked by museums. And disabled people make a very sizable, depending on the statistics, one in 6, 1 in 5 are regularly quoted. So why had that been not only overlooked, but actually, when we looked closer, kind of actively written out of museum narratives? There's a real invisibility of disabled people. So that was another starting point for the project. So before this Rethinking Disability representation, we had an earlier piece of research. It was called Buried in the Footnotes. The findings have been made available online, and I'm going to show some slides from that tomorrow. But basically, we were saying, okay, why have museums done very little to engage with that topic of disability? Perhaps they don't have the material. So we set out to look across, did a big survey of museum collections in the UK, and the short story is that we found hundreds and thousands of objects. We found material related to disability in every collection of every size that we looked at. So given that we found that material and it wasn't displayed, we wanted to try and unpick why that was the case. And part of that answer, at least, came from interviews with curators who revealed a whole set of anxieties about some of the material they held in their collections. How could they show it? They were anxious about getting it wrong. They were fearful of offending disabled visitors, non-disabled visitors. They had material in their collections some of which might lend itself to quite a celebratory narrative in the common with other hidden histories, like how can we look at and celebrate the contributions that disabled people have made to society. But there was also much more worrying material which spoke about pain and oppression and disempowerment, and they were anxious about some of that more contentious material as well. So really these kind of factors together gave birth to Rethinking Disability representation, because we were left with this. We knew there was a lot of material there. We knew curators were quite open to dealing with that topic, but didn't know how, and there was a sense of anxiety. And so our project was born, and we realised what we wanted to do was an action research project. So we wanted to research alongside actually doing. So we wanted to kind of work with museums on actually developing and critiquing that practice as we moved along. So 9 different projects. We're going to focus just really on one today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the others tomorrow, but just to give you a little bit of a flavour. Tyne and Wear Museums in the north of England, their project, one of the 9 projects, was a temporary exhibition, a touring exhibition called 1 in 4, and the title for that exhibition comes from the fact that against 1 in 5 nationally, 1 in 4 people in the Tyne and Wear region kind of qualify technically to be understood as disabled. So there's a kind of higher proportion of disabled people in that region. And Tyne and Wear Museums have got a terrific reputation for working collaboratively with different communities on developing programmes, and they brought that experience to this particular project and worked with a range of groups. They also looked at their own collections, and I think some contemporary collecting and filmmaking as well, to look at shifting attitudes towards disability through time and see how that was reflected and not reflected in their collections. And it was a very powerful exhibition that they developed and toured. The Imperial War Museum did something very, very different for their project. This was one of the 9 projects that didn't result in an exhibition or a display or a film, but instead they chose to develop a series of educational resources for secondary school children. So they ran a series of educational sessions exploring the relationship between conflict and war and disability. A whole range of, and the collections are just fantastic, and the museum really, the educators really got very inspired and excited by the project and really took us in a fantastic direction and looked for a whole range of themes that they could do to look historically into those collections, but really challenge the secondary school children to think very differently about disability today and see how it impacts on their own lives. So, for example, one of the themed sessions they did was called Welcome Home. It was Welcome Home with a question mark, because it looked at the responses which soldiers returning from war, who had become disabled, returning from war, what kind of reception they got. And it went back to kind of First and Second World War, brought it into more modern times. It looked at the Falklands War, and I think one of the stories they told us was about Margaret Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, preventing people with facial disfigurements from appearing in public memorial displays, and what did that say about attitudes to disability and physical difference, but bringing it right up to date with the Iraq War and looking at and interviewing different veterans to explore really that very complex relationship between conflict and disability, but using at all times this social model of disability as a way of pulling at and challenging some of those negative stereotypes which are misleading, which are false, which are oppressive, and looking at ways of trying to encourage the kids there to think differently about that in a more respectful and more progressive way. Which brings us to the film, which I'm going to show in just a second, but just to give it a little bit of context, the film is called Behind the Shadow of Merrick, and it was the project which was developed in partnership with the Royal London Hospital Museum and Archives in London. A small museum, partly its small location inspired us to look at doing the interpretation around a film, because there wasn't a whole range of space for a kind of new exhibit. But also it really lends itself to a film. When you go to this museum, there is already a small area with a number of seats. Visitors can sit down and select which of a handful of films they want to watch. That's part of the collection that they have. The one that is picked most often is the extract of a documentary about Joseph Merrick, more commonly known as the Elephant Man, that many of you will know of that story. It's a very well-known story about, often from the David Lynch film, The Elephant Man, which I think most people are familiar with. But that is the one film that people are most interested in. It's the part of the museum that inspires a lot of curiosity, a lot of interest. And the filmmaker, a disabled filmmaker that we worked with, a guy called David Heavey, who many years ago wrote a really important book called The Creatures That Time Forgot, which was looking at representations of disabled people in a range of ways, but particularly in charity advertising, and was an incredibly important work when it was published. And he's really interested in visual culture and worked with the museum, with the curator, but using, again, this social model of disability, this more progressive way about thinking about disability. How can we retell Merrick's story? And we're going to leave those other films up there. We've got other displays. We've got the, you can see in the top right, Tina, who's one of the kind of characters in the film, who's wearing the hat and veil, those collections that it was Joseph Merrick's own hat and veil that he used to wear. So there's displays in the museum. It's part of a bigger context that people get. But the filmmaker spent a lot of time working with the museum, was very interested in the fact that Merrick's life was in some way, although it's kind of an extreme example because of his particular condition, it's actually quite an archetypal story of disability, about medical intervention, about coming to terms with one's own identity, about the experience of being stared at, of being different, of being exploited, of taking control, kind of whole range of different stages which connected with contemporary disabled people's lives. So Tina, Tim and Rowan are the three contemporary disabled people who feature in this film, and are designed, using again that social model, are designed to give a different version, if you like, of the Merrick story. Probably quite unusual for museum interpretation. It's highly personalised, it's quite a poetic, artistic interpretation, and has proved to be quite provocative, to have sometimes divided both disabled and non-disabled audiences when they watch it. It's about 17 minutes long, and we'll watch that now and then take a break and hear any thoughts that you have before I carry on and tell you some of the results from our evaluation. I should just say we did a major visitor evaluation of all of the 9 projects to look at how it did, if it did, shape the way in which people thought about disability.
There was a man called the Elephant Man, also called a freak. His real name was Joseph Carey Merrick.
I first came across Merrick in the 80s. I knew nothing about him before that. But instantly, because he had a facial disfigurement, I knew we had something very much in common.
I'm Jonathan Evans. I'm the archivist at the Royal London Hospital, and I'm manager of its museum. Well, Joseph Merrick's probably the most famous patient we've had here at the London since it opened, and we have an interesting collection of records and artefacts about him.
I remember around about the age of 7, first hearing about Merrick. As a child, I knew that Merrick lived in a museum. I knew he was dead, but I knew he was there because his body was different. I also knew that my body was different, and I had nightmares about the fact that doctors might put me in the museum. They might put me there before I was dead, and that gave me really scary nightmares.
One group over whom Joseph Merrick casts his shadow are disabled people.
Because he had a facial disfigurement, I knew we had something very much in common. We were hidden inside this mask, and I think it's so hard to show what you feel in your heart, who you really are. The face seems to say so much. Sometimes I feel really cheated by that, and I think there's not a lot I can do about it. And I'm sure Merrick felt like that, even more than me maybe, because he had less of a defined face.
This is an illustration from a medical journal, the Transactions of the Pathological Society of London, and it's an article by Frederick Trees with an illustration of Joseph Merrick. It was published in 1885, and it was the first time that Joseph's medical case had appeared in the medical press.
Merrick had a similar life to me in that sense. He was in institutions, started off in a workhouse because he couldn't get any employment. He didn't have a home right until the end of his life almost. A home he could call his own.
Merrick could be seen as a disabled pioneer because he lived in a typical disabled person's life of impairment, surgery, unemployment, isolation, stared at, and fear of hounding.
I grew up with the myth of the Beauty and the Beast, knowing that the Beast isn't wanted, the Beast is isolated, and if you don't look right, you're automatically the Beast.
People kind of making the comments that they think you don't hear as they go past you. Ugh, that's disgusting, or God, look at that, did you see that? Of course it's a searing pain that goes right through your head. You know, certainly mentally, but it's quite a physical thing as well. And it just seems so unfair that people think that they can do that.
Merrick had that being a spectacle, being made a spectacle for him was a big thing, and it's something that still happens to me and to disabled people today. There's an element of spectacle. We sometimes spectacleize ourselves for different purposes. Sometimes we have to. Sometimes society or the world makes spectacles of us for various reasons. So that is a link. I mean, I have with Merrick, and he would have with lots of disabled people today.
I think Merrick stood out for me so much as somebody that was treated differently because of the way he looked. That's all it was about him, the way he looked.
Merrick, when we were at school, was an insult. It was like spaz, because we all read The Elephant Man and all seen the film, and we're virtually no politics. We were nasty little critters, and so it meant really disabled. It meant a freak or something, because we'd taken that on.
Joseph Merrick sometimes wore a veil, not to hide beauty, but to stop the staring from strangers.
The face is so important. It's the first impression that people have of you. And if that's masked by contortion, it's very difficult to rearrange your face, really, so that you look happy or sad, or people don't know sometimes when I'm happy or sad or when I'm unwell, because they can't read my face.
This is Joseph Merrick's hat and veil, and it was made for him, and he wore it as part of his travelling clothes. He was certainly wearing it before he came to the London hospital, and it stayed with him to the end of his life, and it's been in the hospital ever since. And
I guess it's because my face doesn't tell the story, doesn't tell my feelings. I hate it. I really hate it. I don't like people to see me cry, because my face looks horrible when I cry. Even to the point of having relationships with people, I don't like them to see my face too much.
The hat's made of felt, and the bottom, the veil, is made of linen. It's got a single eye hole, and the hat's got a peak, as you can see.
When I had long hair, I used to hide my face a lot with my hair. I used to love it. It was a security blanket. And I felt protected by it. I mean, he was literally thought of as a thing, an animal, and I mean, people actually think that now sometimes about disabled people. And I guess that he just had to hide away from it through that hood to protect himself against the harsh comments and stares.
The hat is the size of the circumference of a man's waist, and it indicates just how large Joseph's head was. It caused him great difficulty throughout his life, the overgrowth of bone and flesh on his head.
I think it's natural to be interested in difference. I mean, when I look at a picture of John Merrick, I want to know what his face feels like. I want to touch it. I want to know whether it's lumpy or squidgy or hard. I think that's natural. What I don't want to do is fear him or ridicule him, as so many seem to have done.
But what is it like to be stared at and isolated this way?
Oh, public property. I, like many other people, we're public property. We get on a bus, we're a spectacle. From the moment we open the front door, we're a spectacle. You have to be prepared for that, be prepared for the onslaught.
Well, really, whenever I go out in public, I'm stared at, I'm watched, I'm talked about without people approaching and asking questions. Often people do come up and say, "Are you okay?" Or say to the person with me, "Is there any hope?" And sometimes they'll put their hands on me and pray. And for me, that's a pretty much everyday experience.
It depends. Some days I'll go out and I'll be full of confidence and think, sod you all, think what you like. And then other days, especially when I feel delicate and mentally, emotionally delicate, I feel that people can just stare at me as they want to and intrude upon me, and I can't get away from it.
Sometimes Joseph Merrick lived in the dark. You have to feel strong to take on the staring.
Oh, I completely understand that Merrick didn't want to come out except for at night. I went through a few years where I would only let people come to my house if it was past 10 o'clock, when the light had gone down, the light had faded, and it was dusk. And I could join the vampires and come out and play.
Joseph Merrick was given a room of his own at the London hospital, where he wrote, went to the theatre and had royal visitors.
Joseph Merrick lived at the London hospital for the last 4 years of his life, and he's become one of our most celebrated patients. This is Joseph Merrick's calling card, or carte de visite, as they were known in his day. And it was taken, has a photograph, it was taken about 1889, shortly before his death. It shows him wearing his best Sunday suit, and he's looking quite old. His disease was an ageing disease. It was quite a nicely produced artefact, and the sort of thing that he would have given to visitors. In this instance, you can see on the back that he had given this particular example to the chaplain of the hospital, Reverend Tristram Valentine, somebody who would have seen regularly when he was at the hospital. It was later given to a medical student, Miles Phillips.
He kind of owns it. It kind of transforms him into something, the real him.
Joseph Carey Merrick's humanism did come through. Merrick left his version of a poem to be remembered by.
It is true, my form is something odd. Blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I'm sure I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could reach from pole to pole or grasp the ocean with a span, I'd be measured by the soul. The mind's the standard of the man.
The mind's the standard of the man.
What would disabled people say to him now if they could talk to him across time?
If I met Merrick today, but Merrick might not like me when I think about it, because he'd probably be looking for the perfect woman, so-called, you know, someone who's beautiful and certainly without scars. I fear that that would be the case. But if he wasn't like that, even if he was like that, it wouldn't matter, but I would tell him to hold his head up higher. Merrick made his mark on this planet, and it was a pretty good one, and I think he's a role model for a lot of us Crips.
Knowing that Merrick was around as a disabled person, not always hiding who he was, but being out and proud as an individual, feels as though I've got ancestry. He is my ancestor, and I am part of his family. Knowing that I'm still dealing with the issues that he was dealing with over 100 years ago makes me feel sad in some ways, but also proud. It's as though he's a forefather. He went before me, and hopefully there'll be generations like us who go after us.
Merrick's my hero, definitely. Merrick, the human being. Merrick, the guy with the mind, with the emotion. Merrick with the feeling. Merrick, quite a personality and something to be reckoned with. Merrick, the beautiful.
Does anybody want to start us off? Yes.
Were most of the exhibitions photographs or film, or was there also artwork or other type of objects?
No, it's a really good point. There were, probably from the sample that I've shown, it's not so easy to see it, but we really did use a lot of objects in the displays and exhibitions. I'll give you some further examples. I mean, they're really very wide-ranging. So Northampton Museum in the UK has a internationally known collection of footwear. It's famous, so it has a kind of huge shoe collection, and they looked at, so theirs was all objects. It was kind of, they had a few examples of orthopedic shoes, but they used that, showed them up against very high fashion shoes. There's some startling similarities between, for example, bespoke 1920s with a kind of raised platform, and the Vivienne Westwood heels that Naomi Campbell famously fell off, and they put some of those together and played with them, juxtaposed them to get people to think about the idea about fashion and choice, and the fact that the Vivienne Westwood shoes are ones that people will have for a season. They're a kind of, a highly desirable object compared to people's own experiences who've got, who have to wear orthopaedic shoes. Certainly from there's some beautiful examples. The historic examples from the 20s were really beautiful, but the ones that people get today from the hospital, they were very, the whole project was about their own experiences of wearing things they didn't like and didn't have very much choice, so that was all fed through. So that was one example. A couple of others I'm going to touch on tomorrow briefly, but the Museum of Transport in Glasgow had a whole range of transport-related objects, including cars and bicycles and so on, which they used and interpreted alongside film and audio. And also, we really wanted a fine art collection in there. And so Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery has a fantastic historic fine art collection, and the interpretation there was a little similar to this, although with totally different materials. So it was contemporary disabled people, disabled artists' responses to historic works that featured disabled characters in them. So we wanted quite an object rich, and we felt that that was the uniqueness that museums brought to that debate. Objects, real material, authenticity. Thank you.
Have you looked comparatively at this topic in other cultures? I mean, a lot of work on this in the U.S. and how it's different or similar to or the same, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm not sure how fully I can answer that. The book that Janet referenced, myself and the co-director of this project, Jocelyn Dodd, we were working with, there's a third editor, Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's from the States. She's well-known, very well-known in disability studies and women's studies field. So she's helping us bring an international perspective, but we've got contributors in that book. There are some from the States, some from Canada. There are others from Zambia, Taiwan, I'm trying to think where else, Finland, Norway, and we're quite interested in, we found more examples of this work in different countries than we had anticipated, and there are some similarities, I guess, in that there have often been early emerging attempts to grapple with the topic, and some of the things that people have told us, some of the concerns and the reasons why it hasn't been tackled in a more widespread manner in museums have been quite similar so far. But clearly the way in which people think about disability and the politics of that as an identity in somewhere like Taiwan are radically different to in the States, and is going to prove quite a challenge when we come to bring the book together, which the contributions are being written as we speak. I think there are some commonalities, but there will be very significant differences as well. And it's changing. It's been a sort of there are quite a lot of similarities between the disability rights movement, disabled people's movement here and in the UK, which has given us some common ground to work from. But also, as I think you're suggesting, some very important differences, which will be language is a really classic one, because the activists we're working with in the UK have very firm views on current language that they'll use. It's generally disabled people, not people with disabilities, which I understand is more of a preferred term here, and that there's an ebb and a flow that changes. People who are equally passionate and committed about that topic might just share very different language, but actually underneath it, that more progressive, contextualised understanding of disability is actually a more uniting element despite differences in the language.
one of the questions. It strikes me that there are at least sort of three different areas. There's the access issue, which you mentioned, and there's the disability studies, which seem to be a focus here. Then there's the other, which is something that at my museum we talk about, is the issue of representation in exhibitions generally. Sort of, I mean, which gets beyond disability to bodies. What bodies are represented? How do we decide who populates our exhibitions? And that we have tended to go with a certain standardized appearance, which is rooted in cultural aesthetics and all. But that's another piece of this, is how many of us ever have, cast figures of someone in a wheelchair in an exhibition. We tend to assume able-bodied. We also tend to assume smaller and more fit than probably most of us are. So that seems to be another sort of piece, which is the representation. Which is one of the interesting parallels between disability studies and women's studies and African American studies and Latino studies, is the issue of both the sort of special focus, but then the issue of integration. And it seems to me that the integration is one of the pieces. At least I've seen in the U.S. more attention to the sort of special study, the special focus, and less to the integration in other exhibitions. But is there much of that attention to the issue of integration in the UK?
I think it's really absolutely gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it, those comments. I mean, I would say the kind of peopling of exhibitions is a really interesting one. One of the museums we work with was Colchester Museum. It's in the east of England. They have some of the best Roman remains in Britain. And the director, I remember talking to the director of that museum, who was saying their kind of recreation of a street scene in Roman times is full of these figures that, are all 6 foot and quite buff, really. And they're saying, no, not only is that, well, it's factually misleading and inaccurate. And so it was really helpful to me with thinking that, because some people have concerns with some of the projects, they might see a kind of, kind of leftish tendency to be dealing with some of those minority issues, and they might pigeonhole it in that way. And this guy was saying, museums that are generally very concerned with truth and accuracy and objectivity and impartiality and representation in that sense have currently present that incredibly misleading picture of, for example, Roman times, simply through being quite thoughtless about it more than anything. So that, in a sense, that cultural invisibility of disability is utterly misleading and inaccurate in all our in all of our museums, really. And I think when you start to think then, and your second point about integration is really fascinating, because clearly we had a focus here, disability, and some of the projects were temporary exhibitions, and our main fund, the lottery fund, are very, very keen on legacy and sustainability. They gave a lot of money, and they don't just want temporary exhibitions, which is important. So we worked with the museums a lot to say, what is the legacy? Some of them have got elements. So, for example, the Museum of Transport did a temporary exhibition, but part of that work is going into a new permanent display in their new Riverside Museum when that opens next year. The Shoe Museum have taken a temporary exhibition, but they're going to thread some of that thinking through their permanent galleries and into future temporary exhibitions in that mainstreaming, more integrated kind of way, which I think is interesting. So they said, the curator we interviewed there said, well, when we do an exhibition on, I don't know, they said they've done exhibitions in the past on things like wedding shoes, for example, what they might, it's kind of brought some of those issues around diversity to the fore, and they would think about weaving that through other narratives that they have. So I think, and for me, it's a bit of a, not an either or, but a kind of and both. I think sometimes we need the spotlight and the attention and the celebration and the hard-hitting big stuff, and then we also just might weave through the fine art exhibition that I'm going to talk about a bit more tomorrow is an intervention through the existing galleries. So people don't go specifically necessarily to see it. They'll go and see fantastic pre-Raphaelite paintings, and then they'll come across one which has some different interpretation alongside it. So that integration element, I think, is important. Did you want to come in there?
I'm just to build on that. I don't have a lot of information on the work, but in Trafalgar Square, the National Gallery had a sculpture of a very strong woman on a very predominant pillar whose body was disformed. She was a mother, if I recall. I remember the work had been contested and controversial, but that's about all I know about the work. But that to me seems like an example of that integration, but also controversy. Is this objectification? Is this empowerment? Is this inclusion? It brings up, and that to me also triggers what you're saying about curatorial anxiety, right? The sort of like,
yeah.
Are we doing it right? Is this correct? Which to me is responded by the think tank that we're talking about, the advisory committees. Yeah, that work in particular sort of brings. Do you know the work? I don't even know the title of the work.
It's a sculpture of Alison Lapper by an artist called Mark Quinn. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think there's elements about that, and I've used in my teaching before the FDR memorial as well, and that kind of bringing, they've both been very powerful examples of disability being brought into the public sphere and debated. And yes, I mean, there have been some quite shocking responses to that artwork, and it's quite interesting. I mean, the artist himself he's not a disabled artist, and Alison Lapper is an artist herself. She does her own photography of her own body, but he is a very very well-known artist, and she's discussed that before and said, you know, it's kind of interesting that she hadn't had her own work taken up with such popularity, but he's a big name, and when he did that, but she willingly sat for that. It was called Alison Lapper Pregnant. She's pregnant with her boy at the time, and is a very powerful piece for getting people to talk. And the artist, I think, is looking at notions of beauty and normality and sexuality and presenting them in the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square is just, there's millions of people see it every day. It's on the front page of the newspapers. It was in the tabloids. One of the pretty unpleasant tabloids, the headline was not Trafalgar Square but Travolga Square, and it called it vulgar and said it was offensive and rude, and that sparked a whole debate about, well, is it? Why do we think it's offensive and rude? There's other naked statues up all over the place that aren't of disabled figures. Why do we censor some and not others? And that, I think, is quite healthy, really, to see some of that debate. Now, we kind of wanted that debate and have tried to host that debate, but also to frame it in a certain way, like not telling people what to think, but nevertheless offering them a particular view to try and encourage support for that view. One, just to start you off with, one person wrote, a noble exhibit, but perhaps not appropriate for a museum. I want to learn about the Normans, which was a visitor to Colchester Castle, which they might have gone there to find out about history, to find out about the Normans, and were not entirely keen to find our exhibition Life Beyond the Label. But I have to say that's not typical of the responses that we got. There was a huge amount of interest and support from visitors who were very pleasantly surprised to find something they hadn't quite expected and something that was directly challenging to their views, I think. What we did, a range of tools. We used these comments cards across all of the 9 projects. We wanted a research tool that could cut across all 9. So we had one question: how does this display, or does this film, or does this educational session, how does this display change the way you think about disability? And we piloted, took ages to come up with what was the question that was going to work, and we invited people to write or draw their responses, and we got, I can't remember the number, 1,800 responses across the 9 projects, and then we analysed those. But we also did in-depth interviews with visitors across a sample of the sites, and we did observation in the galleries and of the education sessions, and did a range of mixed methods to try and look. And this, we're going to write this up, and the book will, not the Routledge book, but another book we're publishing, so not the international one. We're doing a separate book that's just about our project with the funding that we've got, and I'll make sure I send some copies over to Janet when it's published in December, but it will also be freely available online. We discussed quite a number of aspects of the evaluation there, but just to finish off, I'm going to show you the sort of 5 main ways in which people, the kind of themes that came out of the responses, and give you some examples of that. The first one, and the first 2 really, if you like, are our, crudely put, these would be our success stories. They're ways in which people spoke about disability as a result of their visit that reflected our aims. So quite a lot of people used language which reflected the social model of disability which we had used to frame all of our projects. So that's acknowledging the social barriers and so on. Just to give you some examples, this exhibition was excellent. It reminds you how far society has come but also still to go, and that it is society that causes disability, i.e. not adapting to individuals. So that was somebody who visited 1 in 4, the exhibition at Tyne and Wear Museums, and was quite typical of a lot of those responses that kind of got the idea that we were trying to encourage, if you like. The film that you've just seen made me more aware of people's reactions to disabled people and how those with disabilities can be affected. Even in 2008, disabled people are looked down upon, judged, etc., similar to Merrick was in the 19th century. So acknowledging that social model response, if you like, but in their own words, which was kind of great that people took that away from them. There's also quite a common, a big strand in the responses, which was people drawing on a language of equality and rights to express their views. So somebody who went to one of the school sessions at the Imperial War Museum, so a young person wrote this, I think disabled people should be recognised as equals and should be given equal opportunity. Before I thought if someone was disabled they should stay at home, but my view is very different now. So there's a kind of one of the kids who went to the sessions and was talking, but there was quite a lot of that language of equality and rights. This next one was rather more problematic. I've talked to you about our attempt was to try and challenge that individualised, medicalised view of impairment as a tragedy, as something that is a deficit, something that is problematic in that sense. But it's so ingrained in the way in which we think about disability that this is inevitably comes through. What was interesting was some of these responses really caused a lot of debate in the think tank when we showed them back, because some people were like, this is not social model, this is not what we set out to do, and others said, yeah, but hang on, you can't judge people quite so readily. It's one visit to a museum. You can't really expect people to immediately take on board some of those quite sophisticated concepts. Perhaps this is the first step towards a more empathetic understanding. So Valerie, a woman in her between 56 and 65, non-disabled, she went to visit Glasgow museums. I think it's good to see more being done to help all types of disabilities so that all people are helped to enjoy life without holdbacks. And any more help that could be given, all the better. I just feel fortunate I'm not in the same situation. But who knows what is around the corner of life. Makes me lucky to have the use of my legs, what I always take for granted. So there were quite a lot of responses that do reflect a more impairment as tragedy way of looking at disability. One which is, so there was kind of elements of pity, quite strong. Again, some members of the think tank said, but you know, just as you two have discussed, disability is always in people's unconscious, in people's subconscious. They're fearful. People are anxious about becoming ill, being disabled, and that real fear that people have does often play out in stuff like this about, well, you know, I'm glad that's not me. And so there were more problematic responses, but we're, as I say, not dismissing them totally as the wrong answer, because that's not really within the spirit of the project. I mentioned some of the stereotypes that have been found to be very common in a range of media. Many of those are the more dehumanising, demeaning stereotypes that I've talked about, people as beggars and freaks and so on. But the one category of stereotype that's rather more problematic is the idea of the heroic disabled person, which is seen in disability studies and amongst members of the think tank as equally problematic, even though it is emphasising somebody's bravery, cheerfulness, heroism in somehow managing to transcend their difference. You get the kind of brave hero in the news media all the time, the heroic disabled person. You only have to watch the Paralympics to see the way people are talked about, how incredible and amazing some of these individuals are. So Janine visiting Colchester Museums, the display really moved me and I actually found it quite emotional. I think these people are so brave and there should certainly be more things like this to make human ignorance fade away. Again, just that one particular comment caused loads of debate because some members were kind of saying, oh, that idea about being so brave, it's offensive, we don't want to hear people talk in that way, and others kind of saying, yeah, but look at that, they're talking about human ignorance and it's part of somebody's understanding. But some of those stereotypes did inevitably feed through into some of the responses that we had. And the last one is an interesting one, just to bring this to a close. A number of people question the concept of disability and the idea about a disability, the identity of a disabled person. And this, well, I'll show you the example and then we can kind of talk about it. Somebody to Birmingham, it's a reminder that disability has always been with us. Personally, I've never seen it as a problem, just not keen on the word. We're all disabled in some way. And it was that view, for, you know, for many disabled people, being a disabled person is an entirely part of their identity. It's a very positive ascription to their own identity. But a lot of people uncomfortable with the word saw it as something as if we were drawing attention to something negative. And so that kind of questioning of the concept and saying, you know, on the one hand, there is this continuum. Many people experience being disabled at some point in their lives. It is kind of fuzzy in that sense, but there was this discomfort, I guess, with the term for some people who associated it with a kind of with a negative way of thinking. So there was that questioning kind of played out sometimes in terms of, yeah, this is all good, but why are you making a big issue out of this? Why don't, you know, and it comes back sometimes to that mainstreaming thing. Why, you know, why are you picking it out as a particular issue? So those are the sorts of predominant ways in which people talked about it. We were really pleased with them. There were lots that reflected our aims, others which were more problematic, provoked a lot of debate. But the fact that people definitely engaged with that and responded to it, and many people took up ideas and related them to their own experiences, was seen for us certainly as being something we wanted to take on further and do more with. Of course, the project was, if you like, written or designed to speak to non-disabled people, to change non-disabled people's views, if you like. But of course, lots of disabled visitors inevitably saw, and some of that was, there were some really very powerful responses. One woman who visited Birmingham, where we really mainstreamed, integrated our interpretation throughout the galleries, she wrote on the card, I don't have it here, but she used the space. So she put something up here, she put, at last, I'm here, not here. And it was that idea about being, you know, for herself, having those issues brought to the fore, mainstreamed in a big, public, well-visited institution was an important issue for her, an important sort of affirmation of her own views and value and so on.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. That's been